All right, shalom, everybody. Today we are going to be doing another book review into our Black Jewish History series. And the book that we're going to be reviewing today is called From Babylon to Timbuktu, A History of the Ancient Black Races, including, guess who? The Black Hebrews, all right, by Dr. Rudolph R. Windsor. Now, a couple things about this book, great things about this book is a lot of you already heard of it. Maybe some of you even have it in your libraries. But most importantly, this book is written and authored by a brother. All right, here are some of his credentials. It says here he went to Temple University. He got his bachelor's from Gratz College, and he got his PhD from the University of Metaphysics. All right, a little bit about this author. He's not just a brother, but he is a brother who knows who he is. It says here in the second point, he received inspiration by a black rabbi. Interesting, a black rabbi. Abel Respis, founder of Adet Beit Moshe Synagogue back in the 1950s. See, I want to let you guys know that this movement of us finding out who we are is not new. There are many of our people who knew this prior to the movement even really starting, okay? And I would actually go as far as to say that the movement would not have started if it were not for some of these people like this, like Black Rabbi Abel Respis and this brother here, Rudolph R. Windsor, that helped to pioneer what we see occurring today. Um, but obviously, there has been a concerted effort by the United States and the educational system thereof to suppress this information. But here we are today, we're finding it out. It says here in the third point, it is this encounter that played a key role in Windsor's quest for Black Jewish identity and history. In other words, the same way many of us was introduced to this knowledge, all right, and now we're on the quest that we're on today, the same way this happened with Dr. Rudolph R. Windsor. All right, so here is a introduction in the preface. This gives you the reason and motivation to why he wrote this book. It says here in the second paragraph, he says of his book, my motive in writing it was to give the true history of the Afro-American, which has been excluded from textbooks. I wonder why. Professor Windsor is a strong advocate of the economic and cultural development of the Black community. Man, let me get my pencil and paper out, man. It is time to go to school. All right. And that's what happens when you buy this brother's book. I do want to encourage you all to support the author, support his work. Nonetheless, I will tell you there's a lot of great information within this book. However, I can only put so much in this video. All right. So I'm going to give some of the things that I thought were extremely interesting, and watch to the end. There's some very critical information, especially with regards to our history and how we get here today in the diaspora. I'm going to start here from page 77. It says here in this first paragraph here on the page, since the Hebrew prophets and historians, for example, Josephus, knew that Jews were in Egypt and Ethiopia, the next question is, what are some of the theories concerning their arrival in these countries? So what he is establishing here is a question to go about finding out the information on how these Israelites, these Jews, get into the interiors of Africa. Are these theories true? Are there any credibility to these theories? And if so, where's the information that says this? All right. So let's go through it. It says here on page 86, I'm going to start again where the dash is in the middle of the page. It says the Jews are an omnipresent people. They seem to exist everywhere. At the beginning of the 6th century, they are found in Spain. Wow, interesting. It says before the Mohammedan conquest. Spain is known to the Jews as the classical land of crypto Judaism because they feigned Christianity but practiced Jewish ritual in secret. Wow, that's interesting. Why would you have to pretend like you're a Christian outwardly, but then practice your belief system in secret? Let's see why. It says here, as early as the Roman period, the Jews of Spain had been large in number and influential. Many of them claimed to be descendants of noble Jews in Jerusalem who had been carried into exile by General Titus. This was during uh, the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It says after the Visigoth, a Germanic tribe, invasion, the situation ameliorated for the Jews because the Visigoths adopted the Arian form of Christianity and they favored the Jews. However, when they converted to Catholicism, they became zealous like any other neophytes. The king ascended to the throne in 589. This was the beginning of harsh religious enactments against the Jews. When the king occupied the throne, there was a prevalence of the most religious fanaticisms. In 616 AD, the big shock came. The king ordered the baptism of all the Jews in his domain, under the penalty of expulsion and the loss of all their property. According to Catholic authorities, 90,000 embraced Christianity at this time. This was forced baptism in the 7th century. The Jews were threatened with the penalty of slavery. Watch this again. This is why you see them feigning Christianity. In other words, these Christians were fanatics, all right? See, a lot of you guys don't really know the history of Christianity. You think it's all loving and it's all this and that, and everybody's welcome, and everyone's the same, and God loves everybody, and blah blah blah, all right? It's easy to say that now when all throughout the history of this religion there has been nothing but oppression and forced conversion, okay, over time. But we're on page 86. I want you to keep in mind this last sentence, okay? They feigned Christianity, and in the 7th century, the Jews were threatened with the penalty of slavery if they, turning the page to page 87, if they were found practicing Judaism. In other words, if they were keeping the commandments of God, they would be expelled from those lands or put in slavery. This is pivotal. This is very pivotal. As a matter of fact, I think I showed you guys some of this information in the video that I did on how the early Christian church destroyed the Sabbath. All right. That's an example of this very practice. It says here in the next sentence, this cruel policy caused many Jews to flee to the Mediterranean and western coast of Africa. Wow. Amazing. It says the southernmost point of Spain after you cross the sea lands you in the northern and western coast of Africa. Throughout the Middle Ages, many European governments expelled their Jews. Many European governments expelled their Jews. These black Jews migrated to neighboring countries, Turkey and Africa. All right. And you see here, he puts the curse, right? This is the reason why this is happening, because all of this ultimately goes back to the Deuteronomy 28 curses. It says here in the next paragraph, the Byzantine emperors in the 5th and 6th centuries persecuted the Jews constantly. Therefore, multitudes of Jews were compelled to migrate into the Sahara Desert to the south. By this time, the Sahara Desert was heavily occupied by black Jews. Let me show you an illustration of this, right? This is a map of Africa. At the top of the map, you'll see that little area right at the border it looks like it's touching the top of the part of Africa to the west, but it's actually not. That is Spain, okay? When these Jews are being expelled from Europe, the natural place for them to migrate to is into Africa. And you see here, once you get to North Africa, if you look at that dark gray portion of the screen, that's the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert is exactly what it is. It's a desert. It's uninhabitable. So in order for you to flee or migrate, you either have to stay to the north or you have to migrate to the south. And what we just read is many of these Israelites or Jews would migrate to the sub-Saharan area of Africa. Okay. And this map is actually a picture of the sub-Saharan slave trade and how they would go about trying to find these people, all right, to put them in slavery for not converting into Christianity. All right. It goes on to say on page 88, I don't have a marker here, but I'm going to start at the paragraph toward the top where it says in ancient times. Okay. It says here in ancient times, the Carthaginians from North Africa penetrated the Sahara Desert and the western Sudan during the 2nd and 3rd century BC, when North and Eastern Africa was amassed over a million Jews. I'm going to repeat that sentence. When North and Eastern Africa had amassed over a million Jews. So now we're talking about over a million Jews in the area of Northeastern Africa. Okay. So now you have Jews in Northeast Africa, over a million of them. These Jews began continuous migration to the region of the Niger River. So now you have East African Jews, they're migrating west, as you can see in the demonstration. All right. Again, they started migrating to the region of the Niger River. According to the researches of Nahum Solch, The tradition of the Jewish traders in the Sahara stretches back to biblical times, meaning these people have been in Africa since biblical times. And actually, we can read some of this in your scriptures. All right. It says, Schultz continues, and it is not at all surprising to encounter in every part of the desert traces and even survivals of a primitive Judaism, which is one that played an important role in the whole region of the Sahara, from the Senegal to the very borders of Somaliland. Now, if you look at this map again, that country that's circled in red, that's Senegal. It's all the way to the west of Africa. Somaliland or Somalia is that country that is circled all the way to the right. It's called the Horn of Africa. Basically, what they're telling you is Jews occupied all of this land. Okay. It says here below, or I'm sorry, I skipped something. It says, as I mentioned, I'm going to start where it says, as I mentioned. As I mentioned earlier, this region that extends across the entire width of Africa, below the Sahara Desert, from Senegal to Somaliland, is known as Sudan or Black Africa. In other words, you had Jews, they were migrating south, communities of Jews who were migrating south. You had communities of Jews who were migrating west. All right. And what do you see? You see these communities, these different communities of Jews end up migrating and ending up in the same areas. Okay. They end up toward the Niger River. All right. Moving forward on page 90, I want you guys to really pay attention to this. This is extremely important. I'm going to read this last paragraph. It says the black Jews had an advantage over the African tribes. They carried their culture, history, laws, and written records with them. Brothers, it's very important for us to do this because it is nobody's job to teach you this history but you. It's nobody's job to teach you this history but you. Okay? If you rely on other people and other forces to give you your history, you will end up like we have been today, knowing nothing about your history. All right. It says we carried our culture with us, our history with us, our laws and written records. It says this assured them a constant precedent for the development of a higher social organization. In other words, this is how we're going to grow as a community. We grow as a community by taking care of ourselves, by maintaining our culture, history, heritage, laws, written records, etc. All right. It says because of the stability of the Black Jewish culture, the Jews were not absorbed into other populations, all right, of ethnic Africans. It says, in fact, the Jews absorbed some of the native tribes. The Jews made use of every opportunity. They were an industrious and skillful people. In the Jewish Ghanaian states were found kings, princes, governors, generals, secretaries, treasurers, revenue agents, judges, architects, engineers, doctors, historians, language interpreters, meaning they were bilingual, mathematicians, jewelers, sculptors, masons, carpenters, painters of art, goldsmiths, leather workers, potters, armorers, saddlers, blacksmiths, agriculturalists, etc. Brothers, this is all the occupations that you need to maintain and build civilization. And this shows the greatness that we had prior to being conquered and oppressed by European forces. All right. They don't want you to know that. They're not going to teach. If you think you're going to get taught this in contemporary, modern American education, you are sadly mistaken. All right. Let's move forward. On page 92, this is coming from a brother, a brother by the name of Eldad the Danite or Eldad Hadani. All right, that's his actual name. It says here on page 92, in the 9th century, a black African Hebrew arrived in the city of Kairouan in Algeria. And this city was one of the famous Talmudic schools. So we had Talmudic schools. Okay, many of our peoples did, yes. The name of this Hebrew was Eldad the Danite. He told a credible story of a Hebrew empire south of the Sahara in the western Sudan, so West Africa, all right. According to Eldad the Danite, the Hebrews in the interior of Africa spoke a Phoenician Hebraic language mixed with Arabic. They had a religion which had came down from Moses and a Hebrew emperor, a king. It says it was believed that this emperor was named Tolutan or Bolutan. Eldad said that the people of this tribe had fled from the kingdom of Israel after Sennacherib the Assyrian had subdued it. Brothers, you could read this in your Bible. This is in 2 Kings chapter 17. What he's basically saying is these are northern kingdom tribes who fled from the Assyrian invasion. Okay? Look what he says. He says, after the Assyrian had subdued it, and the other Israelite tribes, such as Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, northern kingdom tribes, were in the land from which he came. In other words, you had northern kingdom Israelites in the interiors of Africa, even during this time, all right, developing civilizations. Now, if you didn't pay attention to anything before this is probably the most important part that I could give you concerning this book. I cannot stress how critical this very information is, starting here on page 115. It says in the paragraph, in the second paragraph toward the bottom, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and Portugal, right? Look what it says here. It was AD 1492. That should be a year that all of us know of. That is the year that Christopher Columbus allegedly discovered the Americas. Christopher Columbus is what? Spanish. He's a conquistador, right? It says January 2nd, when the Moorish stronghold of Granada surrendered to the armies of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. For the first time since the year 711, all of Spain was in Christian hands. The decree to expel the Jews from Spain was signed on March 31st in one of the corridors of the great Alhambra, the palace of the Moorish kings of Granada. The reason given for the expulsion of the Jews was it was thought they corrupted the Moros, Jews who converted to Christianity. So, let me just make sure this is clear. You have two groups of Jews. You have Jews who accepted Christianity, and you had Jews who accepted their own culture. Okay? The Jews who accepted Christianity are called Moranos. Okay? These Jews allegedly were being corrupted by the Jews who practiced their own culture. Again, it says the reason given for the expulsion of the Jews was that it was thought they corrupted the Morenos, Jews converted to Christianity, by privately encouraging them in disloyalty to Christianity. Wow, you can't make this up. In order to satisfy Queen Isabella of Spain, King Manuel of Portugal promulgated a royal decree expelling the Jews and Moors from his country in 1496. Let's go on to the next page. It says on page 116, the Jews were expelled from Spain and Portugal, were scattered throughout the Mediterranean coast. It is estimated that over 100,000 Jews departed from Spain and Portugal during the persecution and the expulsion. Some of the Jews went to northern Europe, Italy, and Turkey, but most of them went to Muslim countries of northern and western Africa. These black Jews would naturally go to African countries most of all because of less persecution, and they could disguise themselves. They could disguise themselves amongst Africans. They could disguise themselves easily among blacks. R.H.M. Elwes gives a graphic description of the Portuguese Jew. Look what he says. Okay. He calls them middle-sized, good features, skin somewhat black, black curly hair. You can't make this stuff up. Long eyebrows of the same color, so that one might know by his looks that he was a descendant from Portuguese Jews. It says when these Jews were expelled from Spain, about 100,000 entered Portugal. They were permitted to enter under the condition that they paid a poll tax, with the understanding that they would leave the country within 8 months. Also, at this time, the king obligated himself to take the Jews wherever they desired. All right, so the point here is that, again, these people were expelled from Spain and Portugal. This is also known as the Spanish Inquisition. And the people who they're expelling, these were Jews, and you can clearly see that the historians will tell you the description of these people. These were black people with black curly hair. You cannot make this stuff up. So I'm going to start again at that sentence. It says, also at this time, the king obligated himself to take the Jews wherever they desired at the termination of the 8 months. When the time expired, many Jews were stranded because the king did not provide enough ships at the time. All the black Jews who were left behind were deprived of their freedom and sold into slavery. In other words, the king obligated himself to say, you guys need to be expelled, you guys need to leave my country, but I will take you wherever you need to go. But he did not deliver on that promise, as is usual when you're depending on another nation to provide you with anything that you need in life. And so when he could not deliver on that promise, what he told them was, well, now you have to lose your freedom and I'm going to sell you into slavery. Amazing. Let's go to the next page. Oh, I'm sorry, let's skip to page 129. All right. I'm going to start at the middle of the page where it says whenever. It says, whenever the Christian Jews could escape from Spain and Portugal beyond the reach of the Inquisition, they threw off the guise of Christianity and practiced Judaism openly. Again, these people were being persecuted, so they had to act like they were Christians. It goes on to say, they threw off the guise of Christianity and practiced Judaism openly, as they did in Turkey. However, the unfortunate new Christians in Portugal or in Portuguese possessions in Western Africa and India and elsewhere could not throw off the disguise of Christianity. The Inquisition even dispatched its inquisitorial agents to the Canary Islands, Madeira, Guinea, India, South America, St. Thomas, and Angola in order to search out secret Jews from 1561 to 1623. About 3,800 individuals were tried. Many of them were Christian Jews of the St. Thomas Island. They were charged with maintaining Jewish principles. Cecil Roth wrote that Christian Jews emigrated to the Portuguese colony of Angola in West Africa, where agents of the Inquisition were sent to hunt them out in 1626. So again, these people were hunted down by Christian agents because they would not confess the religion of Christianity. Let's move on. And this is where it starts to get even more critical. In this next paragraph, it goes on to say, now we can understand why writers like Frederick Rotzel considered the tribes along the Luango and Cabinda coast Christians. These Jews had to maintain a Christian guise, and particularly so in the presence of white people. Any European could have been an agent of the Inquisition. It is certain, I want to make this very clear, it is certain that many black Jews of Portugal and St. Thomas and Angola, who became victims of the Inquisition of the Portuguese persecution, were sold in the slave trade. What slave trade? The transatlantic slave trade. It says this Atlantic slave trade lasted more than 400 years, from 1444 to about 880 in some parts of South America. Now, the reason why I said this was the most important part of this book is because what we are taught in the public schools, what we are taught by the American education system, is that we are slaves from the west coast of Africa. That's the only thing that's where they start you off. Okay. But you have to understand that the public school system, again, they're not going to teach you your history. Okay. And what they do teach is strategically positioned, because to tell you what happened before that will be to admit to you who you are and where you come from and what your culture was. In other words, they have to start you right there, because this is how they went about to destroy our people mentally, educationally, resourcefully, in every way you can name. They began the destruction of our people right there. And you can see the context to which that happened. We read that Jews had migrated from north to the west. We see Jews being expelled. They're all ending up in this area, the sub-Sahara, near the western coast of Africa. And it is from this area where many of you find your ancestry. So, in conclusion, again, the public school system will not teach you this information, and they teach you, or whatever they do teach you, is strategically positioned as the inception of what is taught is immediately after what we just learned. So, with that, I hope you guys got some good information from this book. Again, I encourage you to support the author. Thank you. Shalom.